Chapter 1, Section 2. Constituted or Synthetic Value. Quote, "Value saleable is the cornerstone of the economic edifice." End quote. Constituted value is the cornerstone of the System of Economic Contradictions. What then is this constituted value, which constitutes all Mr. Proudhon's discovery in political economy? Utility being admitted, labor is the source of value. The measure of labor is time. The relative value of products is determined by the labor time it is necessary to employ in order to produce them. Price is the monetary expression of the relative value of a product. Finally, the constituted value of the product is simply the value, which is constituted by the labor time embodied in it. Just as Adam Smith discovered the division of labor, in the same way Mr. Proudhon claims to have discovered constituted value. This is not precisely something unheard of, but then it must also be admitted that there is nothing unheard of in any discovery in economic science. Mr. Proudhon, who feels all the importance of his discovery, nevertheless seeks to attenuate its merits. Quote, "In order to reassure the reader with regard to his pretensions to originality and to conciliate those whose timidity rends them but little favor to new ideas." End quote. But while admitting that each of his predecessors has done something for the appreciation of value, he is compelled to loudly proclaim that it is to him that the greater part, the lion's share, belongs. Quote, "The synthetical idea of value was vaguely perceived by Adam Smith, but this idea of value was entirely intuitive with Adam Smith. Nevertheless, society does not change its habits on the faith of intuitions. It decides only on the authority of facts. It is necessary that the contradiction should be expressed in a clearer and more sensible manner. J.B. Say was its principal exponent." End quote. There is the whole history of the discovery of synthetic value, to Adam Smith vague intuition, to J.B. Say contradiction, to Mr. Proudhon the constituent and constituted truth. And let there be no mistake, all the other economists, from Say to Proudhon, have done nothing but wander in the beaten path of contradiction. Quote, "It is incredible that so many men of sense should for 40 years have struggled against such a simple idea. But no, the comparison of values is effected without there being any point of comparison between them, and without utility of measure. That is what the economists of the 19th century, rather than embrace the revolutionary theory of equality, have resolved to maintain towards and against all. What will posterity say about it?" End quote. Volume 1, page 68. Posterity, so brusquely apostrophized, will commence by being puzzled about this chronology. It must necessarily ask, but were not Ricardo and his school economists of the 19th century? The system of Ricardo, which set forth the principle that the relative value of commodities depends exclusively on the quantity of labor required for their production, appeared in 1817. Ricardo is the chief of a whole school which reigned in England since the Restoration. The Ricardian theory sums up, rigorously, pitilessly, all the doctrine of the English middle class, itself the type of the modern bourgeoisie. What will posterity say about it? It will not say that Mr. Proudhon did not know Ricardo, because he speaks of him, deals with his theory at considerable length, returns to it constantly, and ends by saying that it is rubbish. If ever posterity concerns itself with the subject, it will say, perhaps, that Mr. Proudhon, fearing to shock the Anglophobia of his readers, has preferred to make himself the editor responsible for the ideas of Ricardo. However that may be, it will find it very curious that Mr. Proudhon gave as a revolutionary theory of the future that which Ricardo had scientifically explained as the theory of existing society, of bourgeois society, and that he thus took for the solution of the contradiction between utility and exchange value what Ricardo and his school had, a long time before him, presented as the scientific formula of a single side of that contradiction of exchange value. But let us put posterity altogether on one side and confront Mr. Proudhon with his predecessor, Ricardo. Here are some passages from the author which sum up his theory of value. Quote, "It is not utility which is the measure of exchange value, although that quality is absolutely necessary." End quote. Volume 1, page 3, Principles of Political Economy. Quote, things, once they are recognized as useful in themselves, draw their exchange value from two sources, from their scarcity and from the quantity of labor necessary to acquire them. There are some things the value of which depends only on their scarcity. No amount of labor being capable of increasing their quantity, their value cannot fall through their too great abundance. Such are rare statues, pictures, etc. This value depends solely on the faculties, the tastes, and the caprice of those desirous of possessing such objects. End quote. Volume 1, page 4 and 5. Quote, these, however, form but a very small part of the commodities which are constantly exchanged, the greater number of desirable objects being the fruit of industry. They can be multiplied, not only in one country but in many, to an extent to which it is almost impossible to fix any limits, every time that one is willing to employ the industry necessary to create them. End quote. Volume 1, page 5. Quote, when, then, we speak of commodities, of their exchange value, and of the principles which regulate their relative price, we have in view only these commodities, the quantity of which can be increased by the industry of man, the production of which is encouraged by competition and is not prevented by any obstacle. End quote. Volume 1, page 5. Ricardo quotes Adam Smith, who, according to him, quote, has defined with great precision the primitive source of all exchange value. End quote. Volume 1, Chapter 5 of Smith. And he adds, quote, that such must in reality be the basis of exchange value of all things, namely labor time, except those which the industry of man cannot multiply at will, is a doctrinal point of the highest importance in political economy. For there is no source from which have flowed so many errors, and out of which have sprung so many diverse opinions in this science as from the vague and indefinite sense attached to the word value. End quote. Volume 1, page 8. Quote, if it is the quantity of labor embodied in an article which regulates its exchange value, it follows that every increase in the quantity of labor must necessarily increase the value of the object upon which it has been employed. In the same way, every reduction in the amount of labor must bring about a reduction in price. End quote. Volume 1, page 9. Ricardo afterwards reproaches Smith. 1. Quote, with having given to value a measure other than labor, sometimes the value of wheat, sometimes the quantity of labor which an article would purchase, etc. End quote. Volume 1, page 9 and 10. 2. Quote, with having admitted the principle without reserve, and to have, nevertheless, restricted its application to the rude and primitive state of society which preceded the accumulation of capital and the ownership of land. End quote. Volume 1, page 21. Ricardo devotes himself to demonstrating that the ownership of land, that is to say rent, cannot change the relative value of commodities, and that the accumulation of capital exercises only a passing and oscillating influence on the relative values determined by the comparative quantity of labor employed in the production. In support of this proposition, he formulates his famous theory of rent, decomposes capital, and comes in the final analysis to find that there is nothing but accumulated labor. He afterwards develops a whole theory of wages and profit, and demonstrates that wages and profit rise and fall in inverse ratio the one to the other, without influencing the relative value of the product. He does not ignore the influence which the accumulation of capitals and the difference in their nature, fixed capital and circulating capital, as well as the rate of wages may exercise on the proportional value of the products. There are indeed the principal problems which occupy Ricardo. Quote, every economy of labor, says he, never fails to reduce the relative value of a commodity, whether this economy be effected in the labor necessary to the manufacture of the article itself, or in the labor necessary to the formation of the capital employed in that manufacture. End quote. Volume 1, page 48. Quote, in consequence, while a day's labor continues to give to one the same quantity of fish and to the other the same of game, the natural rate of the respective prices of exchange will remain the same, whatever may otherwise be the variation in wages and in profit, and in spite of all the effects of the accumulation of capital. End quote. Volume 1, page 32. Quote, We have regarded labor as the foundation of the value of things, and the quantity of labor necessary to their production, as the law which determines the respective quantities of commodities which must be given in exchange for others. But we have not pretended to deny that there may be in the current prices of commodities some accidental and passing deviation from this primitive and natural price." End quote. Volume 1, page 105. Quote, "It is the cost of production which regulates in the last analysis the price of things, and not, as has been often advanced, the proportion between supply and demand." End quote. Volume 2, page 253. Lord Lauderdale had developed the variations of exchange value according to the law of supply and demand, or of scarcity and abundance relatively to demand. According to him, the value of a thing would increase when its quantity diminished or demand increased. It would diminish in proportion to the increase of its quantity or to the reduction of demand. Thus the value of anything might change by the operation of 8 different causes, namely, 4 causes appertaining to the thing itself, and 4 causes appertaining to money or any other commodity which served as measure of its value. Here is Ricardo's refutation. Quote, "The products of which an individual or a company has the monopoly vary in value according to the law which Lord Lauderdale has postulated. They fall in proportion as they are supplied in greater quantity, and they rise with the desire of purchasers to acquire them. Their price has no necessary relation to their natural value. But as to the things which are subject to competition between the sellers, and of which the quantity can be increased within reasonable limits, their price depends definitely not upon the state of demand and of supply, but upon the actual costs of production." End quote. Volume 2, page 159. We will leave the reader to compare the precise, clear, and simple language of Ricardo with the rhetorical efforts made by Mr. Proudhon in order to arrive at the determination of relative value by labor time. Ricardo shows us that the real movement of bourgeois production which constitutes value, Mr. Proudhon, making abstraction of his movement, struggles to invent new processes in order to regulate the world according to a professedly new formula, which is only the theoretical expression of the real existing movement so well expounded by Ricardo. Ricardo takes for his point of departure existing society to demonstrate to us how it constitutes value. Mr. Proudhon takes for his point of departure constituted value, in order to constitute a new social world by means of this value. For him, Mr. Proudhon, constituted value must make a circuit and become the constituent for a world already fully constituted according to this mode of valuation. The determination of value by labor time is for Ricardo the law of exchange value. For Mr. Proudhon, it is the synthesis of use value and exchange value. The theory of value of Ricardo is the scientific interpretation of actual economic life. The theory of value of Mr. Proudhon is the utopian interpretation of the theory of Ricardo. Ricardo proves the truth of his formula by drawing his conclusions from all the economic relations and in explaining by this means all the phenomena, even those which at first sight appear to contradict it, such as rent, the accumulation of capitals, and the connection between wages and profits. That is precisely what makes of his theory a scientific system. Mr. Proudhon, who has rediscovered this formula of Ricardo's by means of entirely arbitrary hypotheses, is compelled afterwards to seek for isolated economic facts which he tortures and falsifies, in order to make them serve as examples, applications already existing, of the beginnings of the realization of his regenerating idea. See our section 3, Applications of Constituted Value. Let us now pass on to the conclusions which Mr. Proudhon draws from value constituted by labor time. A given quantity of labor equals the product created by the same quantity of labor. Every day's labor is worth another day's labor. That is to say, in equal quantity, the labor of one is worth the labor of another. There is no qualitative difference. Given an equal quantity of labor, the product of one will exchange for the product of another. All men are wage workers, and equal wages pay for an equal time of labor. Perfect equality presides over the exchange. Are these conclusions the natural, rigorous consequences of value constituted or determined by labor time? If the relative value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor required to produce it, it naturally follows that the relative value of labor or wages must be equally determined by the quantity of labor which is necessary to produce the wages. The wage, that is to say, the relative value or price of labor, is then determined by the labor time which is necessary to produce all that is required for the subsistence of the worker. Quote, reduce the cost of manufacturing hats, and eventually their price will fall to the new natural price. Although the demand may be doubled, trebled, or quadrupled, reduce the cost of subsistence of men by reducing the natural price of the necessary food and clothing, and you will see wages eventually fall, although the demand for hands may have considerably increased. Ricardo, Volume 2, page 253. Certainly the language of Ricardo is most cynical. To put in the same category the cost of manufacturing hats and the cost of subsistence of man is to transform man into a hat. The cynicism is in the things themselves and not in the words which express these things. Some French writers, such as M. Droz, Blanqui, Rosy, and others, have given themselves the innocent satisfaction of proving their superiority to the English economists by seeking to observe the etiquette of humanitarian language. If they reproach Ricardo and his school with their cynical language, it is because they are annoyed at seeing economic conditions exposed in all their crudity, at seeing the mysteries of the bourgeoisie betrayed. Let us sum up. Labor, being itself a commodity, measures itself as such by the labor time necessary to produce this labor commodity. And what is necessary to produce the labor commodity? Exactly that amount of labor time which is necessary to produce the objects indispensable to the constant subsistence of labor. That is to say, to enable the workers to live and to propagate his race. The natural price of labor is nothing but the minimum wage. If the current price of wages rises above the natural price, it is precisely because the law of value, postulated in principle by Mr. Proudhon, finds itself counterbalanced by the consequences of the variations in the relation between supply and demand. But the minimum wage is, nevertheless, the center towards which the current price of wages constantly gravitates. Thus, relative value, measured by labor time, is fatally the formula of the modern slavery of the worker, instead of being, as Mr. Proudhon would have it, the revolutionary theory of the emancipation of the proletariat. Let us now see how many cases the application of labor time as the measure of value is incompatible with the existing antagonism of classes and the unequal distribution of the product between the immediate worker and the possessor of accumulated labor. Let us suppose a certain product, for instance, linen. This product, as such, embodies a definite quantity of labor. This quantity of labor will be the same, no matter what may be the reciprocal positions of those whose labor has combined to create this product. Let us take another product, cloth, which has exacted the same quantity of labor as the linen. If there is an exchange of these products, there is an exchange of equal quantities of labor. In exchanging these equal quantities of labor, we do not change the reciprocal position of the producers any more than we change something in the situation of the workers and manufacturers among them. To say that this exchange of products measured by time has, for its consequence, the equal remuneration of all the producers is to suppose that equality of participation has existed anterior to the exchange. When the exchange of the cloth for the linen has been accomplished, the producers of the cloth will share in the linen in precisely the same proportions as they before shared in the cloth. The illusion of Mr. Proudhon proceeds from his taking as a necessary consequence what at the most can be nothing but a gratuitous assumption. Let us go further. Does labor time as the measure of value suppose at least that the days are equivalent and that the day of one is worth the day of another? No. Assuming for a moment that the day of a jeweler is worth 3 days of a weaver, all changes in the value of jewels relatively to the value of woven stuffs must always, apart from the passing effects of the oscillation of supply and demand, have for cause a reduction or an increase on one side or the other of the time employed in production. Let 3 days of labor of different workers in the proportion of 1, 2, 3. And all change in the relative value of their products will be a change in this proportion of 1, 2, 3. Thus value may be measured by labor time in spite of the inequality of value of different days of labor. But to apply a similar measure, it is necessary for us to have a comparative scale of the different days of labor. It is competition which establishes this scale. Is your hour of labor equal to mine? That is a question debated and settled by competition. Competition, according to an American economist, determines how many days of simple labor are contained in a day of complex labor. Does not this reduction of days of complex labor to days of simple labor suppose that simple labor is itself taken as a measure of value? The single quantity of labor serving as the measure of value supposes in its turn that simple labor has become the pivot of industry. It supposes that labors are equalized by the subordination of man to the machine, or by the extreme division of labor, that men are effaced before labor, that the balance of the pendulum has become the exact measure of the relative activity of two workers as it is of the speed of two locomotives. Then it is not necessary to say that the hour of one man is worth the hour of another man, but rather that a man of 1 hour is worth another man of an hour. Time is everything, man is nothing. He is no more than the carcass of time. There is no more question of quality. Quantity alone decides everything, hour for hour, day for day. But this equalization of labor is not the work of Mr. Proudhon's eternal justice. It is solely the accomplishment of modern industry. In the automatic workshop, the labor of one worker is scarcely distinguished in anything from the labor of another worker. The workers cannot distinguish between themselves except by the quantity of time they work. Nevertheless, the quantitative difference becomes, at a certain point of view, qualitative, inasmuch as the time given to work depends, in part, on purely material causes, such as physical constitution, age, and sex, in part on purely negative moral qualities, such as patience, impassibility, assiduity. Lastly, if there is a difference of quality in the labor of the workers, it is at most a degree of the last quality, which is far from being a distinctive speciality. Such is, in the final analysis, the state of things of modern industry. It is on this already realized equality of automatic labor that Mr. Proudhon bases his plane of equalization, which he proposes to realize universally in the time to come. All the equalitarian consequences which Mr. Proudhon draws from the doctrine of Ricardo rest upon a fundamental error. That is, that he confounds the value of commodities measured by the quantity of labor embodied in them with the value of commodities measured by the value of labor. If these two methods of measuring the value of commodities were confounded in one, we might say indifferently, the relative value of any commodity is measured by the quantity of value embodied in it, or it is measured by the quantity of labor which it is able to purchase, or, again, it is measured by the quantity of labor which will purchase it. It is necessary, indeed, that it should be thus. The value of labor could no more serve as a measure of value than the value of any other commodity. Some examples will serve to more fully explain the point above. If a quarter of wheat cost 2 days' labor instead of 1, it would have double its primitive value. But it would not put in motion a double quantity of labor, because it would contain no more nutritive matter than before. Thus the value of the wheat measured by the quantity of labor employed to produce it would have doubled, but measured either by the quantity of labor that it could buy or by the quantity of labor by which it could be bought, it would be far from having doubled. On the other hand, if the same labor produced double the amount of clothing as before, the relative value would fall to 1/2. But nevertheless, this double quantity of clothing will not thereby be reduced to command only half the quantity of labor, nor could the same quantity of labor command double the quantity of clothing, as the half of the clothing would continue to render to the workers the same service as before. Thus, to determine the relative value of commodities by the value of labor is contrary to economic facts. It is to move in a vicious circle to determine relative value by a relative value which, in its turn, needs to be determined. It is beyond doubt that Mr. Proudhon confounds the two measures, the measure by the labor time necessary to the production of a commodity, and the measure by the value of labor. The labor of every man, says he, will produce the labor which it embodies. Thus, according to him, a certain quantity of labor embodied in a product equals in value the remuneration of the worker. that is to say, the value of labor. It is, once more, the same reason which leads him to confound the costs of production with wages. Quote, "What are wages? They are the price of the amount of wheat, etc., the integral price of all things." End quote. Let us go further still. Quote, "Wages are the proportionality of the elements which compose wealth." End quote. What are wages? They are the value of labor. Adam Smith takes as measures of value sometimes the labor time necessary to the production of a commodity, sometimes the value of labor. Ricardo exposed this error by showing clearly the disparity between these two methods of measuring. Mr. Proudhon enhances the error of Adam Smith by identifying the two things which the latter had only placed in juxtaposition. It is in order to find the just proportion in which the workers should share in the products, or, in other terms, to determine the relative value of labor, that Mr. Proudhon seeks for a measure of the relative value of commodities. To determine the measure of the relative value of commodities, he can think of nothing better than of giving as the equivalent of a certain quantity of labor the sum of the products that it has created, which amounts to supposing that the whole of society consists solely of direct workers receiving for wages their own produce. In the second place, he sets forth as a fact the equality of the days of different workers. To sum up, he seeks the measure of the relative value of commodities in order to discover the equal remuneration of the workers, and he assumes, as an already established fact, equality of wages in order to discover the relative value of commodities. What admirable dialectic! Quote, "Say, and the economists who have followed him have observed that labor being itself subject to valuation, a commodity like any other, in fact, to take it for a principle and the efficient cause of value would be to move in a vicious circle. These economists, if they will permit me to say so, have shown by that a prodigious inattention. Labor is called value, not as being a commodity itself, but in view of the value supposed to be potentially embodied in it. The value of labor is a figurative expression, an anticipation of the cause and the effect. It is a fiction of the same kind as the productivity of capital. Labor produces, capital denotes value. Labor, like liberty, is a vague and indefinite thing by nature, but it becomes qualitatively defined by its object. That is to say, it becomes a reality by its product. Let us hear old Bois-Guilbert. Quote, "The price of commodities," says he, "must always be proportioned, there being only this intelligence which can make them live together to constantly give and receive reciprocally." See the continual exchangeability of Mr. Proudhon. Birth to one another. As wealth, then, is only this constant intercourse between man and man, between métier and métier, it is a fearful blindness to seek for the cause of poverty elsewhere than in the cessation of such commerce, brought about by the derangement in the proportion of prices." End quote. Dissertation sur la nature des richesses. Listen also to a modern economist. Quote, "A great law which must be applied to production is the law of proportion, which can alone preserve the continuity of value. The equivalent must be guaranteed. All the nations have essayed at different epochs, by means of numerous commercial regulations and restrictions, to realize up to a certain point this law of proportion, but egoism, inherent in the nature of man, has forced him to overthrow all this regulation regime. A proportional production is the realization of the entire truth of the science of social economy." End quote. W. Atkinson, Principles of Political Economy, London 1840, page 170 to 195. Fouille Troja. This true proportion between supply and demand, which again begins to become the object of so many vows, has long ceased to exist. It has died of old age. It was only possible in the epoch in which the means of production were limited, and in which exchange only took place within very narrow limits. With the birth of the great industry, this just proportion disappeared, and production was fatally constrained to pass in a perpetual succession through the vicissitudes of prosperity, depression, crisis, stagnation, new prosperity, and so on in succession. Those who, like Sismondi, would return to the just proportion of production while conserving the existing basis of society, are reactionary since, to be consistent, they must also desire to re-establish all the other conditions of past times. What was it which maintained production in just proportion, or nearly so? It was the demand which governed the supply which preceded it. Production followed consumption step by step. The great industry, forced by the very instruments of which it disposed to produce on an ever-increasing scale, could not wait for the demand. Production preceded consumption. The supply forced the demand. In existing society, in the industry based on individual exchanges, the anarchy of production, which is the source of so much misery, is at the same time the source of all progress. Thus, of two things, one. Either you would have the just proportions of past centuries with the means of production of our epoch, in which case you are at once a reactionary and a utopian, or you would have progress without anarchy, in which case, in order to conserve productive forces, you must abandon individual exchanges. Individual exchanges accord only with the small industry of past centuries and its corollary of just proportion, or with the great industry and all its train of misery and anarchy. After all, the determination of value by labor time, that is to say, the formula which Mr. Proudhon has given us as the regenerating formula of the future, is then only the scientific expression of the economic relations of existing society, as Ricardo has clearly and definitely demonstrated it long before Mr. Proudhon. But at least the equalitarian application of this formula belongs to Mr. Proudhon. Is it he who has first thought of reforming society by transforming all men into immediate workers, exchanging quantities of equal labor? Is it indeed for him to make to the communists, these people innocent of all knowledge of political economy, these obstinately stupid men, these paradisical dreamers, the reproach of not having found before him this solution of the problem of the proletariat? Whoever is, no matter how little, acquainted with the movement of political economy in England knows that nearly all the socialists of that country have, at different times, proposed the equalitarian application of the Ricardian theory. We may cite to Mr. Proudhon the Political Economy of Hopkins, William Thomson, An Inquiry into the Principles of the Distribution of Wealth, most conducive to human happiness, 1827, T.R. Edmonds, Practical, Moral, and Political Economy, 1828, etc., etc., and we might add pages of etc. We will content ourselves with quoting an English communist. We will reproduce the decisive passage of his remarkable work, Labor's Wrongs and Labor's Remedy, Leeds, 1839, and we will dwell upon it at sufficient length, in the first place because J.F. Bray is yet but little known in France, and further, because we believe we have there found the key of the past, present, and future works of Mr. Proudhon. Quote, "The only way to arrive at truth is to go at once to first principles. Let us go at once to the source from whence governments themselves have arisen. By thus going to the origin of the thing, we shall find that every form of government and every social and governmental wrong owes its rise to the existing social system, to the institution of property as it at present exists, and that therefore, if we would end our wrongs and our miseries at once and forever, the present arrangements of society must be totally subverted and supplanted by those more in accordance with the principles of justice and the rationality of man. Quote, by thus fighting them upon their own ground, and with their own weapons, we shall avoid that senseless clatter respecting visionaries and theorists with which they are so ready to assail all who dare move one step from that beaten track which by authority has been pronounced to be the only right one. Before the conclusions arrived at by such a course of proceeding can be overthrown, the economists must unsay or disprove those established truths and principles on which their own arguments are founded." End quote. J.F. Bray, page 17 and 41. Quote, "It is labor alone which bestows value. Every man has an undoubted right to all that his honest labor can procure him. When he thus appropriates the fruits of his labor, he commits no injustice upon any other human being, for he interferes with no other man's right of doing the same with the produce of his labor. All these ideas of superior and inferior, of master and man, may be traced to the neglect of first principles, and to the consequent rise of inequality of possessions. And such ideas will never be eradicated, nor the institutions founded upon them be subverted, so long as this inequality is maintained. Men have hitherto blindly hoped to remedy the present unnatural state of things, and to institute equality of rights and laws by removing one rich tyrant and setting up another, by destroying existing inequality and leaving untouched the cause of the inequality. But it will shortly be seen that it is not in the nature of any mere governmental change to afford permanent relief, that misgovernment is not a cause, but a consequence, that is not the creator, but the created, that it is the offspring of inequality of possessions, and that inequality of possessions is inseparably connected with our present social system." End quote. J.F. Bray, page 33, 36, and 37. Quote, "Not only are the greatest advantages, but strict justice also, on the side of a system of equality. Every man is a link, and an indispensable link, in the chain of effects, the beginning of which is but an idea, and the end, perhaps, the production of a piece of cloth. Thus, although we may entertain different feelings towards the several parties, it does not follow that one should be better paid for his labor than another. The inventor will ever receive, in addition to his just pecuniary reward, that which genius only can obtain from us, the tribute of our admiration." End quote. Quote, "From the very nature of labor and exchange, strict justice not only requires that all exchangers should be mutually, but that they should likewise be equally benefited. Men have only two things which they can exchange with each other, namely, labor, and the produce of labor. Therefore, let them exchange as they will. They merely give, as it were, labor for labor. If a just system of exchanges were acted upon, the value of all articles would be determined by the entire cost of production, and equal values should always exchange for equal values. If, for instance, it takes a hatter one day to make a hat, and a shoemaker the same time to make a pair of shoes, supposing the material used by each to be of the same value, and they exchange these articles with each other, they are not only mutually but equally benefited. The advantage derived by either party cannot be a disadvantage to the other, as each has given the same amount of labor, and the materials made use of by each were of equal value. But if the hatter should obtain 2 pairs of shoes for one hat, time and value of material being as before, the exchange would clearly be an unjust one. The hatter would defraud the shoemaker of one day's labor, and were the former to act thus in all his exchanges, he would receive for the labor of half a year, the product of some other person's whole year. Therefore the gain of the first would necessarily be a loss to the last. We have heretofore acted upon no other than this most unjust system of exchanges. The workmen have given the capitalist the labor of a whole year in exchange for the value of only half a year. And from this, and not from the assumed inequality of bodily and mental powers in individuals, has arisen the inequality of wealth and power which at present exists around us. It is an inevitable condition of inequality of exchanges, of buying at one price and selling at another, that capitalists shall continue to be capitalists, and working men be working men, the one a class of tyrants and the other a class of slaves. The whole transaction, therefore, plainly shows that the capitalists and proprietors do no more than give the working man for his labor of 1 week a part of the wealth which they obtained from him the week before, which just amounts to giving him nothing for something. The whole transaction, therefore, between the producer and the capitalist is a palpable deception, a mere farce. It is, in fact, in thousands of instances, no more than a barefaced, though a legalized robbery." End quote. J.F. Bray, page 45, 48, 49, and 50. Quote, "The gain of the employer will never cease to be the loss of the employed, until the exchanges between the parties are equal, and exchanges never can be equal while society is divided into capitalists and producers, the last living upon their labor, and the first bloating upon the profit of that labor." End quote. Quote, "It is plain," continues Bray, "that you may establish whatever form of government you will, that you may talk of morality and brotherly love, No such reciprocity can exist when there are unequal exchanges, and inequality of rewards for equal services. Inequality of exchanges, as being the cause of inequality of possessions, is the secret enemy that devours us. End quote. Quote, it has been deduced also from a consideration of the intention and end of society, not only that all men should labor and thereby become exchangers, but that equal values should always exchange for equal values, and that, as the gain of one man ought never to be the loss of another, value should ever be determined by the cost of production. But we have seen that, under the present arrangements of society, all men do not labor, that the gain of the capitalist and the rich man is always the loss of the workman, that this result will invariably take place, and the poor man be left entirely at the mercy of the rich man, so long as there is inequality of exchanges, and that equality of exchanges can be ensured only under social arrangements in which labor is universal. If exchanges were equal, the wealth of the present capitalists would gradually go from them to the working classes. End quote. Bray, page 51, 52, 53, and 55. Quote, so long as the system of unequal exchanges is tolerated, the producers will be almost as poor and as ignorant as hard-worked as they are at present, even if every governmental burden be swept away and all taxes be abolished. Nothing but a total change of system, unequalizing of labor and exchanges, can alter the state of things for the better, and ensure men a true equality of rights. The producers have but to make an effort, and by them must every effort for their own redemption be made, and their chains will be snapped asunder forever. As an end, political equality is a failure. As a means, also, it is a failure. Where things are of equal value, and they are exchanged unequally, the gain of one exchanger must ever be the loss of another, for every exchange is then simply a transfer, and not a sacrifice of labor and wealth. Thus, although under a social system based on equal exchanges, a parsimonious man may become rich, his wealth will be no more than the accumulated produce of his own labor. He may exchange his wealth, or he may give it to others, who will exchange it for an equal value of the wealth of other persons. But a rich man cannot continue wealthy for any length of time after he has ceased to labor. Under equality of exchanges, wealth cannot have, as it has now, a procreative and apparently self-generating power, such as replenishes all waste from consumption, for, unless it be renewed by labor, wealth, when once consumed, is given up forever. That which is now called profit and interest cannot exist. As such, in connection with equality of exchanges, for producer and distributor would be alike remunerated, and the sum total of their labor would determine the value of the article created and brought to the hands of the consumer. The principle of equal exchange, therefore, must from its very nature ensure universal labor. End quote. Bray, page 67, 88, 89, 94, 109, and 110. After having rebutted the objections of the economists to communism, Bray continues thus, quote, if a changed character be essential to the success of the social system of community in its most perfect form, and if, likewise, the present system affords no circumstances and no facilities for effecting the requisite change of character and preparing man for the higher and better state desired, it is evident that things must remain as they are, unless some preparatory steps be discovered and made use of, some movement partaking partly of the present and partly of the desired system, some intermediate resting place, to which society may go with all of its faults and all of its follies, and from which it may move forward, imbued with those qualities and attributes without which the system of community and equality cannot as such have existence. End quote. Bray, page 134. Quote, the whole movement would require only cooperation in its simplest form. Cost of production would in every instance determine value, and equal values would always exchange for equal values. If one person worked a whole week and another worked only half a week, the first would receive double the remuneration of the last, but this extra pay of the one would not be at the expense of the other, nor would the loss incurred by the last man fall in any way upon the first. Each person would exchange the wages he individually received for commodities of the same value as his respective wages, and in no case could the gain of one man or one trade be a loss to another man or another trade. The labor of every individual would alone determine his gain and his losses." End quote. Quote, "By means of general and local boards of trade, the directors attach to each individual company the quantities of the various commodities which, for consumption, the relative value of each in regard to each other, the number of hands required in various trades and descriptions of labor, and all other matters connected with the production and distribution, could in short time be as easily determined for a nation as for an individual company under the present arrangements. As individuals compose families, and families towns, under the existing system, so likewise would they after the joint stock change had been effected. The present distribution of people in towns and villages, bad as it is, would not be directly interfered with. Under this joint stock system, every individual would be at liberty to accumulate as much as he pleased, and to enjoy such accumulations when and where he might think proper. Society would be, as it were, one great joint stock company, composed of an indefinite number of smaller companies, all laboring, producing, and exchanging with each other on terms of the most perfect equality." End quote. Quote, "Our new system of society by shares, which is only a concession made to existing society in order to arrive at communism, established in such a way as to admit of individual property in productions in connection with a common property in production powers, making every individual dependent on his own exertions, and at the same time allowing him an equal participation in every advantage afforded by nature and art, is fitted to take society as it is, and to prepare the way for other and better changes." End quote. Bray, page 158, 160, 162, 163, 168, 170, and 194. We have only a few words to say in reply to Mr. Bray, who, quite in spite of ourselves, we find to have supplanted Mr. Proudhon, inasmuch as Mr. Bray, far from wishing to have the last word of humanity, only proposes such measures as he believes good for a period of transition between existing society and a system of communism. An hour of the labor of Peter is exchanged for an hour of the labor of Paul. That is the fundamental axiom of Mr. Bray. Suppose Peter has performed 12 hours' work and Paul has only done 6. Then Peter will only be able to make with Paul an exchange of 6 against 6. Peter will consequently have 6 hours' labor remaining. What will he do with these 6 hours of labor? Either he will do nothing with them, that is to say, he will have worked 6 hours for nothing, or maybe he will idle 6 hours in order to equalize matters, or again, and this is his last resource, he will give to Paul these 6 hours, with which he can do nothing else, into the bargain. Thus, at the end of the account, what has Peter gained on Paul? Some hours of labor? No, he will have gained only some hours of leisure. He will be compelled to be an idler for 6 hours. And for this new right of idleness to be not only accepted but appreciated in the new society, it is necessary that the latter should find its highest felicity in laziness, and that labor should weigh upon it like a chain from which it must free itself at any cost. Yet still, if these hours of leisure which Peter has gained over Paul were only a real gain, but no, Paul, in beginning by working only 6 hours, arrives by steady and regular labor at the same result as Peter, only obtains by commencing with an excess of labor. Each would desire to be Paul. There would be competition to obtain the position of Paul, a competition of idleness. Ah well, what has the exchange of equal quantities of labor given us? Overproduction, depreciation, overwork, followed by an enforced idleness. In fine, the economic relations, such as we see them in existing society, less the competition of labor. But no, we deceive ourselves. There would be still an expedient by which the new society, the society of Peter's and Paul's, could be saved. Peter might eat all alone the product of the 6 hours of labor which remain to him. But the moment in which there is no more exchanging in order to have a product, There's no longer production in order to exchange, and all the supposition of a society founded on exchange and the division of labor falls to the ground. We should have saved the equality of exchanges only through the cessation of exchange. Paul and Peter would have arrived at the condition of Robinson Crusoe. Then, if we imagine all the members of society to be workers, the exchange of equal quantities of hours of labor is only possible on condition that we understand beforehand the number of hours necessary to employ in material production, but such an understanding denies individual exchange. We shall still arrive at the same result if we take for a starting point not the distribution of the products created, but the act of production. In the great industry, Peter is not free to fix for himself the time of his labor, because the labor of Peter is nothing without the cooperation of all the Peters and all the Pauls in the establishment. It is this which clearly explains the obstinate resistance of the English manufacturer to the 10 hours bill. They knew very well that a reduction of 2 hours' labor given to the women and children would be sure to result in a reduction of the hours of labor of adult men. It is in the nature of the great industry that the hours of labor should be equal for all. That which is today the result of capital and the competition of the workers among themselves will be tomorrow, if you cut off the relation between labor and capital, the effect of an understanding based on the relation of the sum of the productive forces to the sum of existing wants. But such an understanding is the condemnation of individual exchange, and so we arrive once more at our first result. In principle, there is no exchange of products, but exchange of the labors which cooperate in production. The mode of exchange of the products depend upon the mode of production of the productive forces. Generally, the form of the exchange of products corresponds to the form of production. Change the latter, and the former finds itself changed as a consequence. We may also see in the history of society the mode of exchanging products regulated by the method of producing them. Individual exchange also corresponds to a determined method of production, which itself corresponds to the antagonism of classes. Thus there is no individual exchange without the antagonism of classes. But the honest consciences refuse to accept this evidence. So long as one is bourgeois, one cannot do other than see in this relation of antagonism a relation of harmony and eternal justice, which permits no one to get value at the expense of another. For the bourgeois, individual exchange can exist without the antagonism of classes. For him, these are two entirely incompatible things. Individual exchange, as it presents itself to the bourgeois, is far from resembling individual exchange as it is in actual practice. Mr. Bray makes of the illusion of the honest bourgeois the ideal which he desires to realize. In purifying individual exchange, in freeing it from all the antagonistic elements he finds in it, he believes he has found an equalitarian relation which he desires to see adopted by society. Mr. Bray does not see that this equalitarian relation, this collective ideal, which he wishes to apply to the world, is itself nothing but the reflection of the existing world, and that it is in consequence quite impossible to reconstitute society on a basis which is only an embellished shadow. In proportion as this shadow becomes substance, it is seen that this substance, far from being the dreamed of transfiguration, is nothing but the body of existing society. Footnote: like all other theories, this of Mr. Bray has had its partisans who have been deceived by appearances. In London, Sheffield, Leeds, and many other towns in England have been founded some equitable labor exchange bazaars. These bazaars, after having absorbed considerable capital, have all failed miserably. People have lost the taste for them forever. Let Mr. Proudhon take note. End of footnote. Section 3. Application of the law of the proportion of value. A. Money. Quote, gold and silver are the first commodities, the value of which has arrived at its constitution. End quote. Gold and silver, then, are the first applications of the constituted value of Mr. Proudhon, and as Mr. Proudhon constitutes the values of products in determining them by the comparative quantity of labor they embody, all that he had to do was to prove that variations which have taken place in the value of gold and silver were always to be explained by the variations in the time of labor necessary to produce them. Mr. Proudhon does not dream of that. He does not speak of gold and silver as commodities, he speaks of them as money. All his logic, if logic there be, consists in juggling with the quality which gold and silver possess, of serving as money, for the benefit of all the commodities which have the quality of being valued by labor time. Decidedly, there is more of simplicity than malice in this shuffling. A useful product being valued by the labor time necessary to produce it is always acceptable in exchange. Witness, cries Mr. Proudhon, gold and silver, which find themselves in my desired conditions of exchangeability. Then gold and silver are value arrived at the state of constitution. They are the incorporation of the idea of Mr. Proudhon. He is most happy in his choice of an example. Gold and silver, in addition to the quality which they possess of being commodities, valued like all other commodities by labor time, have further that of being the universal agent of exchange, of being money. In taking now gold and silver as an application of value constituted by labor time, nothing is more easy than to prove that every commodity, the value of which may be constituted by labor time, will be always exchangeable, will be money. A very simple question presents itself to the mind of Mr. Proudhon. Why have gold and silver the privilege of being the type of constituted value? Quote, the particular function which usage has devolved upon the precious metals of serving as the agent of commerce is purely conventional, and every other commodity could, less conveniently perhaps, but in a sufficiently satisfactory manner, fill this role. The economists recognize and cite more than one example of this. What then is the reason for this preference generally accorded to the precious metals, of serving as money, and how long is this specialty of functions of money, without analogy in political economy, to be explained? Is it possible to re-establish the series from which money seems to have been detached, and thereby to bring it back to its true principle? End quote. Already, in putting the question in these terms, Mr. Proudhon has supposed the existence of money. The first question he should have put is, why in the exchanges, as they are actually constituted, exchange value should have had to be individualized, so to speak, by the creation of a special agent of exchange? Money is not a thing, it is a social relation. Why is the relation of money a relation of production, like every other economic relation, such as the division of labor, etc.? If Mr. Proudhon had clearly ascertained this relation, he would not have seen in money an exception, a member detached from a series, unknown or to be discovered. He would, on the contrary, have recognized that this relation is a link of, and as such, intimately attached to, the whole chain of the other economic relations, and that this relation corresponds to a determined mode of production, neither more nor less than individual exchange. What does he do? He begins by detaching money from the whole of the existing mode of production, in order later to make it the first member of an imaginary series, a series to be discovered. Once the necessity for a special agent of exchange, that is to say, the necessity for money, is recognized, it is only necessary to explain why this particular function has developed upon gold and silver rather than upon any other commodity. That is a secondary question, which is not explained by the chain of the relations of production, but by the specific qualities inherent in gold and silver as material. If, after all, the economists on this occasion have, quote, gone outside their own science, and have made this a physical, a mechanical, and historical question, etc., end quote, as Mr. Proudhon has reproached them with having done, they have only done what they ought. The question is no longer within the domain of political economy. Quote, what none of the economists, says Mr. Proudhon, has either seen or comprehended is the economic reason which has determined in favor of the precious metals the privilege which they enjoy. End quote. The economic reason which no one, and with good cause, has either seen or comprehended, Mr. Proudhon has seen, comprehended, and bequeathed to posterity. Quote, But what no one has remarked is that, of all commodities, gold and silver are the first the value of which has been constituted. In the patriarchal period, gold and silver were bought and sold and exchanged in ingots. But even then, with an obvious tendency to domination, and with a marked preference. Little by little, monarchs took possession of them and set their seal upon them, and from this sovereign consecration sprang money, that is to say the commodity par excellence, which, in spite of all the shocks of commerce, maintains a fixed proportioned value and makes itself accepted in payment everywhere. The distinctive feature of gold and silver, I repeat, arise from this that, thanks to their metallic properties, to the difficulties attending their production, and, above all, to the intervention of the public authority, they have at an early stage conquered, as commodities, fixity and authenticity. To say that, of all commodities, gold and silver are the first the value of which has been constituted, is to say, after all which has preceded it, that gold and silver are the first commodities which have become money. That is the great revelation of Mr. Proudhon. That is the truth which no one has discovered before him. If by these words Mr. Proudhon has wished to say that gold and silver are commodities, the time necessary to the production of which has been sooner known than in the case of any others, that would still be one of the suppositions with which he is so ready to gratify his readers. If we wish to hold to this patriarchal erudition, we should say to Mr. Proudhon that the time necessary for the production of the objects of prime necessity, such as iron, etc., was known in the first place. We would make him a present of the classic ark of Adam Smith. But after all, how can Mr. Proudhon speak of the constitution of a value, since one value is never constituted alone? It is constituted not by the time which is necessary for its production alone, but relatively to the quota of all other products which can be created in the same time. Thus the constitution of the value of gold and silver presupposes the constitution to be already established of a mass of other products. It is then not the commodity which has arrived, in gold and silver, at the state of constituted value. It is the constituted value of Mr. Proudhon which has arrived in gold and silver at the state of money. Let us now examine more closely these economic reasons which, according to Mr. Proudhon, have afforded gold and silver the advantage of being erected into money, sooner than all other products, of passing to the constitutive state of value. These economic reasons are the marked preference, already in the patriarchal period, and other circumlocutions of the same fact, which augment the difficulty, since they multiply the fact in multiplying the incidents which Mr. Proudhon brings forward to explain the fact. Mr. Proudhon has not yet exhausted all the pretended economic reasons. Here is one of supreme force, irresistible. Quote, "It is from the sovereign consecration that money springs. The monarchs seize gold and silver and place their seal upon them." End quote. Thus the good pleasure of monarchs is, for Mr. Proudhon, the supreme reason in political economy. Truly, it is necessary to be entirely innocent of all historical knowledge not to know that in all times sovereigns have had to submit to the economic conditions and have never made laws for these. Legislation, political as well as civil, could do no more than give expression to the will of the economic conditions. Has the monarch seized gold and silver to make them the universal agents of exchange by impressing his seal upon them? Or have these universal agents of exchange not rather taken possession of the monarch by forcing him to impress his seal upon them, and thus give them a political consecration? The imprint which has been, and is, given to money is not that of its value, it is that of its weight. The fixity and authenticity of which Mr. Proudhon speaks applies only to the standard of the money, and this standard indicates how much of material metal there is in a coined piece of gold or silver. Quote, "The sole intrinsic value of a silver mark," said Voltaire, with his usual good sense, "is that of a mark of silver, a half-pound of the weight of 8 ounces. The weight and the standard alone makes this intrinsic value." End quote. Voltaire, System de Law. But the question, what is the value of an ounce of gold or of silver still remains. If a cashmere from the establishment of the great Colbert bore the trademark of the manufactory pure wool, this mark would still not tell us the value of the cashmere. The question of how much the wool was worth would still remain. Quote, Philip I, King of France, says Mr. Proudhon, mixed with the pound sterling of Charlemagne a third of alloy, imagining that as he alone had the monopoly of the manufacture of money, he could do what any trader having a monopoly can do. What was the effect of this alteration of the coinage with which Philip and his successors had been so strongly reproached? A very sound reasoning from the commercial point of view, but very unsound in economic science, is to suppose that, as supply and demand regulate value, it is possible, either by producing an artificial scarcity or by monopolizing the manufacture, to increase the estimation and consequently the value of things, and that this is true of gold and silver as well as of corn, wine, oil, or tobacco. However, the fraud of Philip was no sooner suspected than his money was reduced to its proper value, and he at once lost all that he imagined he had gained out of his subjects. The same thing would happen as the result of any similar attempts. To begin with, it has been demonstrated over and over again that if the monarch debases the coinage, it is he who suffers the loss. What he has gained once by the first issue, he loses as many times as the falsified money returns to him in the form of duties, taxes, etc. But Philip and his successors knew how to more or less protect themselves from this loss, as, once the debased money was put in circulation, they had nothing to do but to order a general reminting of money at the old standard. And, besides, if Philip I had really reasoned like Mr. Proudhon, Philip would not have reasoned well from the commercial point of view. Neither Philip I nor Mr. Proudhon show any evidence of mercantile genius when they imagine that it is possible to alter the value of gold as well as that of every other commodity, simply because that value is determined by the relation of supply and demand. If King Philip had ordered that a quarter of wheat should be henceforth called 2 quarters, he would have been a swindler. He would have deceived all of the fund holders, all of the people who had to receive 100 quarters of wheat. He would have been the cause of all these people receiving, instead of 100 quarters, only 50. Suppose the king to owe 100 quarters of wheat, he would have only really had to pay 50. But in commerce, 100 such quarters would never be worth more than 50. In changing the name, we do not change the thing. The quantity of wheat, either in supply or demand, would not be diminished or increased by this simple change of name. Thus the relation of supply to demand being precisely the same in spite of this change of name, the price of the wheat would undergo no real alteration. In speaking of the supply and demand of things, we do not speak of the supply and demand of the name of things. Philip I was not the maker of gold or silver. As Proudhon says, he was the maker of the name of monies. Make your French cashmeres pass for Asiatic cashmeres, and it is possible that you may deceive a buyer or two. But once the fraud becomes known, and your pretended Asiatic cashmeres will fall to the price of the French article. In giving a false standard to gold and silver, King Philip could only make dupes so long as the fraud was not known. Like any other shopkeeper, he deceived his customers by false description of the commodity, but that could not last long. Sooner or later, he must suffer the rigor of the laws of commerce. Is it that which Mr. Proudhon wishes to prove? No. According to him, it is from the monarch, and not from the commerce, that money receives its value. And what is it that he has effectively proved? That commerce is more sovereign than the monarch. Let the monarch order that a mark shall be henceforth 2 marks. Commerce will always tell you that these 2 marks are only worth 1 mark as before. But for all that, the question of the determination of value by the quantity of labor has not been taken a step further. It still remains to be decided if the value of these 2 marks, again become the original mark, is determined by the cost of production or by supply and demand. Mr. Proudhon continues, quote, It may be equally assumed that if, instead of altering the money, it had been in the power of the king to double its quantity, the exchange value of gold and silver would have immediately fallen to half, always in consequence of this proportion and equilibrium. If this opinion, which Mr. Proudhon shares with the economists, is correct, it is a proof in support of their theory of supply and demand, and not in support of the proportion of Mr. Proudhon. Because, whatever may have been the quantity of labor embodied in the double quantity of gold and silver, its value would have fallen by half, the demand remaining the same and the supply having doubled. Or is it indeed by chance that the law of proportion confounds itself this time with the so despised law of supply and demand? This just proportion of Mr. Proudhon is in effect so elastic, it lends itself to so many variations, combinations, and permutations, that it may possibly for once coincide with the relation of supply and demand. To make every commodity acceptable in exchange, if not in fact at least by right, in basing it on the function performed by gold and silver, is then to misunderstand this function. Gold and silver are only acceptable in exchange by right, because they are so in fact, and they are so in fact because the existing organization of production has need of a universal agent of exchange. The right is only the official recognition of the fact. We have seen this, that the example of money as an application of value passed to the state of constitution has been chosen by Mr. Proudhon only that he might smuggle in the whole of his theory of exchangeability, that is to say, in order to demonstrate that every commodity valued by its cost of production must arrive at the state of money. All that would be beautiful and good, but for the difficulty that precisely gold and silver as money are of all commodities the only ones which are not determined by their cost of production. And that is so far true that in circulation they may be replaced by paper, inasmuch as there will be a certain proportion observed between the needs of circulation and the quantity of money issued, whether the money be in paper, in gold, in platinum, or in copper. There can be no question of any proportion to be observed between the intrinsic value, the cost of production, and the nominal value of money. Undoubtedly, in international commerce, the value of money, as that of every other commodity, is determined by labor time. But that is simply because gold and silver in international commerce are means of exchange as products, and not as money. That is to say that, in this connection, gold and silver lose that very character of fixity and authenticity, of sovereign consecration, which is for Mr. Proudhon their specific characteristic. Ricardo has so well understood this truth that after having based his whole system on value determined by labor time, and after having said, quote, "Gold and silver, as well as all other commodities, have value only in proportion to the quantity of labor necessary to produce them and put them on the market," end quote. He added nevertheless that the value of money is not determined by the labor time embodied in its substance, but only by the law of supply and demand. Quote, "Although paper money has no intrinsic value, nevertheless, if its quantity be limited, its exchange value may equal the value of metallic money of the same denomination, or of bullion estimated as specie. It is by the same principle, that is to say, by the limitation of the quantity of money, that coins of a low standard are able to circulate at the same value as they would have had if their weight and their value were those fixed by law, and not at the intrinsic value of the pure metal which they contain. That is why in the history of English money we find that our currency has never been depreciated in the same proportion as it has been changed. The reason is that it has never been multiplied in proportion to its depreciation." End quote. Ricardo. J.B. Say on the subject of this passage of Ricardo observes, quote, "This example should suffice, it seems to me, to convince the author that the basis of all value is not the quantity of labor necessary to produce a commodity, but the need which exists for that commodity, balanced by its scarcity." End quote. Thus money, which is for Ricardo no longer a value determined by labor time, and which J.B. Say takes for that reason as an example to convince Ricardo that other values cannot be any more than money, determined by labor time, this money, I say, which is taken by J.B. Say as the example of value determined exclusively by supply and demand, becomes for Mr. Proudhon the example par excellence of the application of value constituted by labor time. To conclude, if money is not a value constituted by labor time, still less can it have anything in common with the just proportion of Mr. Proudhon. Gold and silver are always exchangeable because they have the particular function of serving as the universal agent of exchange, and not at all because they exist in the proportionate quantity to the mass of wealth, or, to speak more correctly, they are always in proportion because alone of all commodities they serve as money, as the universal agent of exchange, whatever may be their quantity relatively to the whole mass of wealth. Quote, "The money in circulation can never be sufficient to cause a glut, because if you reduce its value, you augment its quantity in the same proportion, and increasing its value, you diminish the quantity." End quote. Ricardo. Quote, "What an imbroglio is political economy," end quote, cries Mr. Proudhon. "Accursed gold," ironically exclaims a communist by the mouth of Mr. Proudhon. It would be as reasonable to say, accursed wheat, accursed vines, accursed sheep, seeing that, quote, "in the same way as gold and silver, all commercial value must arrive at its exact and rigorous determination," end quote. The idea of sheep and vines being brought to the state of money is not new. In France, that idea belongs to the period of Louis XIV. At that epoch, money having begun to establish its omnipotence, there was great complaint of the depreciation of all other commodities, and the people prayed most ardently for the moment in which every commercial value would arrive at its exact and rigorous determination, at the state of money. Here is what we find in Bois-Guilbert, one of the oldest economists of France. Quote, "Money then, by this growth of innumerable competitors, which will be the commodities themselves established in their exact values, will be restricted to its natural limits." End quote. Économistes financiers du XVIIIe siècle, page 422. We see that the first illusions of the bourgeoisie are also their last. Part B. Surplus labor. Quote, "We read in some works on political economy this absurd hypothesis: if the price of all things were doubled. As if the price of all things was not the proportion of things, and as if one could double a proportion, a relation, a law." End quote. Proudhon, Volume 1, page 81. The economists have fallen into this error through not having known how to apply the law of proportion and of constituted value. Unfortunately, we find in the work of Mr. Proudhon, Volume 1, page 110, this absurd hypothesis, that if wages were raised generally, the price of everything would rise. Furthermore, if the phrase in question is found in a work of political economy, there is also the explanation, quote, "If we say that the prices of all commodities rise or fall, we always exclude one commodity or another, the commodity excluded being generally either money or labor." End quote. Encyclopedia Metropolitan, or Universal Dictionary of Knowledge, Volume 4. The article on Political Economy by Senior, London, 1836. See also on this expression John Stuart Mill, Essays on some Unsettled Questions of Political Economy, London, 1844, and Tooke, A History of Prices, etc., London, 1838. Let us now pass to the second application of constituted value and other proportionalities, whose single failing is that they are so little proportioned, and see if Mr. Proudhon is more happy in that than in the monetization of sheep. Quote, "An axiom generally admitted by the economists is that all labor must leave a surplus. This proposition is for me a universal and absolute truth. It is the corollary of the law of proportion, which may be regarded as the summary of the whole science of economy. But I must crave the pardon of the economists. The principle that all labor must leave a surplus has, in their theory, no meaning, and is not susceptible of demonstration." End quote. Proudhon. In order to prove that all labor must leave a surplus, Mr. Proudhon personifies society. He makes a personal society, a society which is not, so much as it is necessary, the society of persons, since it has its laws apart, having nothing in common with the people composing society, and its own intelligence, which is not the common intelligence of men, but an intelligence which has no common sense. Mr. Proudhon reproaches the economists with not having understood the personality of this collective being. We are pleased to oppose him the following passages from an American economist who reproaches the other economists with quite the opposite fault. Quote, "The moral entity in the grammatical being called society has been clothed with attributes which have no existence except in the imagination of those who make a thing with a word. That it is which has led to so many difficulties and to such deplorable mistakes in political economy." End quote. T.H. Cooper, Lectures on the Elements of Political Economy, Columbia, 1826. Quote, "This principle of the surplus of labor," continues Mr. Proudhon, "is true of individuals only because it emanates from society, which thus confers upon them the benefit of its own laws." End quote. Does Mr. Proudhon wish by that to say simply that the production of the social individual exceeds that of the isolated individual? Is it of this surplus of the production of associated individuals over that of non-associated individuals that Mr. Proudhon is to be understood to speak? If that is so, we can cite 100 economists who have expressed this simple truth without all the mysticism with which Mr. Proudhon surrounds it. Here is what Sadler, for instance, says on the subject. Quote, "Combined labor gives results which individual labor could never produce. In proportion, then, as people increase in number, the products of their united industry will greatly exceed the sum of a simple addition calculated on this increase. In mechanical arts, as in the labors of science, a man can actually do more in a day than an isolated individual could do in the whole of his life. The axiom of the mathematician that the whole is equal to the parts is not true, as applied to this subject. As to labor, the great pillar of human existence, it may be said that the product of accumulated efforts greatly exceeds all that individual and separate efforts could ever accomplish." End quote. T. Sadler, The Law of Population, London, 1830. To return to Mr. Proudhon. The surplus of labor, he says, explains itself by society personified. The life of this personal society follows laws opposed to the laws by which man acts as an individual, as he will prove by facts. Quote, "The discovery of an economic process can never be worth to the inventor the profit which it yields to society. It has been remarked that railway undertakings have been much less a source of riches to the owners than to the state. The average price for the transport of commodities by road is 18 centimes per ton per kilometer, goods called for and delivered. It has been calculated that at this rate an ordinary railway undertaking would not clear 10% net profit, a return nearly equal to that of road cartage. But admitting that the speed of railway transport is to road transport as 4-to-1, as in society, time is money, the railway would show an advantage over the road of 400%. This enormous advantage, however, very real for society, is far from being realized in the same proportion by the railway proprietor, who, while he enables society to enjoy an additional value of 400%, does not draw himself even 10%. Let us suppose, to make the matter clearer, that the railway increases its tariff to 25 centimes, that of road transport remaining at 18. It would immediately lose all its consignments. Traders and their consignees, everybody, in fact, would return to the old road wagons. The locomotive would be deserted. A social advantage of 400% would be sacrificed to a loss of 35%. The reason is easy to comprehend. The advantage arising from the speed of the railway is entirely social, and each individual participates in it only in a minimum proportion. Remember, we are dealing here only with the transport of merchandise. While the loss falls directly upon the consumer personally, a social benefit of 400 represents, for the individual, if the society only number 1,000,000 men, 4 10,000s. While a loss of 33% for the consumer would suppose a social deficit of 33 millions. End quote. Proudhon. Mr. Proudhon not only expresses a quadrupled speed of 400% of the primitive celerity, but he sets up a relation between the percentage of speed and the percentage of profit, and establishes a proportion between two conditions which, although they may be separately estimated at so much %, are nevertheless incommensurable with each other. This is to establish a proportion between the percentages and to leave out the denominations. Percentages are always percentages. 10% and 400% are commensurable. They are to each other as 10 is to 400. Then, concludes Mr. Proudhon, a profit of 10% is worth 40 times less than a quadrupled speed. In order to save appearances, he says that for society, time is money. This error arises from the fact that he confusedly recollects that there is a relation between value and labor time, and he has nothing to do but assimilate labor time with the time of transport. That is to say, he identifies the drivers, guards, and firemen, whose labor time is nothing but the time of transport, with the whole of society. For this master stroke, behold speed become capital, and in such case he is quite right to say, quote, a benefit of 400% would be sacrificed to a loss of 35%, end quote. After having set up this strange proposition as a mathematician, he gives us the explanation as an economist. Quote, a social benefit equal to 400 represents, for the individual, if the society is only one of a million of men, 4 10,000s, end quote. Certainly. But it is not a question of 400. It is a question of 400%. And a benefit of 400% represents neither more nor less than 400% for the individual. Whatever may be the capital, the dividends will be always in the proportion of 400%. What does Mr. Proudhon do? He takes the percentage for the capital and, as though he feared that his confusion was not sufficiently manifest, sufficiently clear, he continues, quote, a loss of 33% for the consumer would suppose a social deficit of 33 millions, end quote. 33% of loss for the consumer would remain a loss of 33% for a million consumers. How can Mr. Proudhon say afterwards definitely that the social deficit in the case of a loss of 33% would amount to 33 millions when he does not know either the social capital or even that of a single one of those interested? Thus, it is not sufficient for Mr. Proudhon to have confounded the capital and the percentage, but he must go further still, and identify the capital put into the undertaking with the number of those concerned. Quote, let us suppose, to make the matter still clearer, end quote, a determined capital. A social profit of 400% shared among a million participants, supposing each to be interested to the extent of a franc, would mean 4 francs profit per head, and not 0.004 as Mr. Proudhon pretends. In the same way, a loss of 33% for each of the participants would represent a social deficit of 330,000 francs, and not 33 millions. The ratio of 100 to 33 is equal to the ratio of 1 million to 330,000. Mr. Proudhon, preoccupied with his theory of personified society, forgets to make the division by 100. He thus obtains 330,000 francs loss. But 4 francs per head profit make for the society a profit of 4 million francs. There remains for society a net profit of 3,670,000 francs. This account exactly demonstrates the opposite to that which Mr. Proudhon wished to demonstrate. That is, that the profits and losses of society are not in inverse ratio to the profits and losses of the individual. After having rectified these simple errors of calculation, let us glance for a moment at the consequences to which we should arrive if we were to admit for railways this relation of speed to capital, such as Mr. Proudhon gives it, lest the errors of calculation. Suppose a transport 4 times as rapid costs 4 times as much. This transport would not give less profit than the road transport, which is 4 times as slow, and costs only a quarter as much. Then, if the latter charges 18 centimes, the railway could charge 72 centimes. This would be, according to mathematical rigor, the consequence of the supposition of Mr. Proudhon, always excepting his errors of calculation. But then he suddenly tells us that if, instead of 72 centimes, the railway charged 25, it would at once lose all its consignments. Decidedly, it would be necessary to return to the old road wagons. Only if we have any advice to offer Mr. Proudhon, it is not to forget in his program of the Progressive Association to make the division by 100. But alas, it is scarcely to be hoped that our advice will be listened to, for Mr. Proudhon is so enamored of his progressive calculation, corresponding to the progressive occasion, that he cries with much emphasis, quote, I have already shown in Chapter 2, by the solution of the contradiction of value, that the advantage of every useful discovery is incomparably less for the inventor, whoever he may be, than for society. I have carried out the demonstration of this point with mathematical rigor. End quote. Let us return to the fiction of society personified, a fiction which has no other object than to prove the following simple truth. A new invention causing a larger quantity of commodities to be produced with the same amount of labor results in a fall in the saleable value of the product. Society makes a profit then, not in obtaining more exchangeable values, but in obtaining more commodities for the same value. As to the inventor, competition causes his profit to fall successively to the general level of profits. Has Mr. Proudhon proved this proposition as well as he wished to do? No. That does not prevent him from reproaching the economists with having failed to make this demonstration. To prove to him the contrary, we will only cite Ricardo and Lauderdale. Ricardo, the chief of the school which determines value by labor time; Lauderdale, one of the most vigorous defenders of the determination of value by supply and demand. Both have developed the same thesis. Quote, in constantly augmenting the facility of production, we constantly diminish the value of some of the things already produced, although by the same means we not only add to the national wealth, but we increase the facility of producing for the future. As soon as by means of machines, or by our knowledge of physics, we force natural agents to do the work which has previously been done by man, the value of this work falls in consequence. If it takes 10 men to turn a corn mill, and it is discovered that by means of wind or water the labor of these 10 men can be saved, the flour which will be the product of the action of the watermill from that moment fall in value, in proportion to the amount of labor saved, and society will find itself enriched by all the value of the things which the labor of these 10 men can produce, the funds destined to the support of the workers not having by that suffered the least diminution. End quote. Ricardo. Lauderdale, in his turn, says, quote, there is no part of the capital of a country that more obviously derives its profits from supplanting a portion of labor that would otherwise be performed by man, or from performing a portion which is beyond the reach of his personal exertion, than that which is vested in machinery. The small profit which the proprietors of machinery generally acquire when compared with the wages of labor which the machine supplants, may perhaps create a suspicion of the rectitude of this opinion. Some fire engines, for instance, draw more water from a coal pit in one day than could be conveyed on the shoulders of 300 men, even assisted by the machinery of buckets, and a fire engine undoubtedly performs its labor at a much smaller expense than the amount of the wages of those whose labor it thus supplants. This is, in truth, the case with all machinery. All machines must execute the labor that was antecedently performed at a cheaper rate than it could be done by the hand of man. If such a privilege is given for the invention of a machine which performs by the labor of one man a quantity of work that used to take the labor of 4, as the possession of the exclusive privilege prevents any competition in doing the work, but what proceeds from the labor of the 4 workmen, their wages, as long as the patent continues, must obviously form the measure of the patentee's charge. That is, to secure employment, he has only to charge a little less than the wages of the labor which the machine supplants. But when the patent expires, other machines of the same nature are brought into competition, and then his charge must be regulated on the same principle as every other, according to the abundance of machines. The profit of capital employed in foreign trade, though it arises from supplanting labor, comes to be regulated, not by the value of the labor it supplants, but, as in all other cases, by the competition among the proprietors of capital, and it will be great or small in proportion to the quantity of capital that presents itself for performing the duty, and the demand for it. End quote. an inquiry into the nature and origin of public wealth. Finally, then, in proportion as the profit may be greater than in other industries, fresh capital will be thrown into the new industry until the average profits in it have fallen to the common level. We have just seen that the illustration of the railway was scarcely appropriate for throwing any light on the fiction of personified society. Nevertheless, Mr. Proudhon hardily continues his discourse. Quote, "These points cleared, nothing is more easy than to explain how labor must leave to each producer a surplus." End quote. This which now follows belongs to classic antiquity. It is a poetic romance told in order to relieve the reader from the fatigue he has suffered from the rigor of the mathematical demonstrations which have preceded it. Mr. Proudhon gives to his personified society the name of Prometheus, whose noble traits he glorifies in these terms. Quote, "At first, Prometheus, springing from the bosom of nature, awakes to life in an inertia full of charms, etc., etc. Prometheus sets to work, and from his first day, the first day of the second creation, the product of Prometheus, that is to say his wealth, his well-being, is equal to 10. The second day, Prometheus divides his labor, and his product becomes equal to 100. The third day and every following day, Prometheus invents machines, discovers new utilities in his body, new forces in nature. At each step that his industry takes, the amount of his production increases, and denotes to him an increase in felicity. And finally, since for him, to consume is to produce, it is clear that each day's consumption, absorbing only the product of yesterday, leaves a surplus product for the day after." End quote. This Prometheus of Mr. Proudhon is a droll sort of fellow, as feeble in logic as in political economy. Insofar as Prometheus only informs us of the division of labor, the application of machinery, the exploitation of natural forces and scientific power, multiplying the productive forces of men and giving a surplus as compared with the product of isolated labor, this new Prometheus has only the misfortune of coming too late. But when Prometheus begins to speak of production and consumption, he becomes really grotesque. To consume is, for him, to produce. He consumes next day that which he produced the day before. Thus he has always a day in hand. This day in hand is his surplus of labor. But in consuming the next day that which he produced the day before, it is necessary that on the first day, which he had no yesterday, he should have worked 2 days, in order to, afterwards, have a day in hand. How did Prometheus gain this surplus on the first day, when there was neither division of labor nor machinery, nor even any knowledge of physical forces except fire? Thus the question, in order to have been deferred to the first day of the second creation, has not advanced a step. This manner of explaining things derived at the same time from the Greek and the Hebrew, which is at once mystic and allegorical, gives to Mr. Proudhon the perfect right to say, quote, "I have demonstrated by theory and by fact the principle that all labor must leave a surplus." End quote. The facts, they are the famous progressive calculation. The theory, it is the myth of Prometheus. Quote, "But," continues Mr. Proudhon, "this principle, accurate as an arithmetical proposition, is yet far from being realized for everybody. While by the progress of collective industry, each day of individual labor creates a larger and still larger product, and by a necessary consequence, while the worker, with the same wages, must become richer every day, there exists in society some classes which thrive, and others which perish." End quote. In 1770, the population of the United Kingdom of Great Britain was 15 millions, and the productive population 3 millions. The scientific power of production would about equal a population of 12 more millions, thus making a total of 15 millions of productive forces. Thus the productive power was to the population as 1 is to 1, and the scientific power was to manual power as 4 is to 1. In 1840, the population did not exceed 30 millions. The productive population was 6 millions, while the scientific power amounted to 650 millions. That is to say, that it was to the whole population as 21 to 1, and to manual power as 108 to 1. In English society, the day of labor had thus acquired in 70 years a surplus of 2,700% of productivity. That is to say that in 1840 it produced 27 times as much as in 1770. According to Mr. Proudhon, it is necessary to put the following question. Why is the English workman of 1840 not 27 times richer than the workman of 1770? In putting such a question, one would naturally suppose that the English had been able to produce these riches without the historical conditions in which they were produced, such as the private accumulation of capital, the modern division of labor, the automatic workshop, anarchic competition, the wage system, and, in fine, all that which is based upon the antagonism of classes having to exist. But these were precisely the necessary conditions for the development of the productive forces and of the surplus of labor. Thus, it was necessary, in order to obtain this development of the productive forces and this surplus of labor, that there should be some classes which thrive and others which perish. What then, in the last place, is this Prometheus resuscitated by Mr. Proudhon? It is society. It is the social relations based on the antagonism of classes. These relations are not the relations of individual to individual, but of workman to capitalist, of farmer to landlord, etc. Efface these relations, and you have extinguished the whole of society, and your Prometheus is nothing more than a phantom without arms or legs, that is to say, without the automatic workshop, without the division of labor, wanting, in fine, all that you have originally endowed him with in order to enable him to obtain this surplus of labor. If then, in theory, it suffices to interpret, as Mr. Proudhon does, the formula of the surplus of labor in the sense of equality without taking account of the actual conditions of production, it must suffice in practice to make among the workers an equal distribution of wealth without changing anything in the actual conditions of production. This distribution would not assure a great degree of comfort to each of the participants. But Mr. Proudhon is not so pessimistic as one might believe him to be. As proportion is everything for him, it is indeed necessary that he should see in his fully endowed Prometheus, that is to say in actual society, a commencement of the realization of his favorite idea. Quote, but everywhere also the progress of riches, that is to say the proportion of values, is the dominant law. And when the economists oppose to the complaints of the social party the progressive growth of the public wealth, and the amelioration effected in the condition of even the most unfortunate classes, they proclaim, without suspecting it, a truth which is the condemnation of their theories. End quote. What, in effect, are collective riches? Public wealth? They are the wealth of the bourgeoisie, and not that of each individual bourgeois. Well, the economists have simply demonstrated how, in the relations of production as they exist, the wealth of the bourgeoisie has developed and must still grow. As to the working classes, it is still a much debated question whether their condition has been ameliorated at all as a result of the growth of the so-called public wealth. If the economists cite to us, in support of their optimism, the example of the workers engaged in the English cotton industry, they only notice their position in the rare moments of commercial prosperity. These moments of prosperity are to the epochs of crisis and stagnation in the exact proportion of 3 to 10. But perhaps also, in speaking of amelioration, the economists may have wished to refer to the millions of workers condemned to perish in the East Indies, in order to procure for the 1.5 million of work people employed in England in the same industry 3 years of prosperity out of 10. As to the temporary participation in the growth of public wealth, that is different. The fact of the temporary participation is explained by the theory of the economists. It is the confirmation of that theory, and not the condemnation, as Mr. Proudhon says. If there was anything to condemn, it would certainly be the system of Mr. Proudhon, which, as we have demonstrated, would reduce the worker to the minimum wage in spite of the growth of riches. It is only by reducing the worker to the minimum wage that he could make an application of the exact proportion of values, of value constituted by labor time. It is because wages, in consequence of competition, oscillate above and below the price of the necessities of life essential to the sustentation of the worker, that he can not only participate to however small a degree in the development of the collective wealth, but also that he can perish of want. There is the whole theory of the economists which sets up no illusion. After his long divagations on the subject of railways, of Prometheus, and of the new society to be reconstituted on constituted value, Mr. Proudhon reflects. Emotion overcomes him, and in a paternal tone he cries, quote, I adjure the economists to question themselves a moment, in the silence of their hearts, far from the prejudices which disturb them, and without regard to the employments which occupy or which await them, to the interests which they serve so ill, to the approbation to which they aspire, or to the distinctions which their vanity craves, that they should say, if to this day the principle that all labor must leave a surplus has been apparent to them with this chain of preliminaries and of consequences that we have raised. End quote.